This is Rob Cedar, and in today's segment, we're going to continue with part 2 of setting up our laptop data center using Hyper-V on Windows 8. In part 1, we covered how to install Hyper-V on Windows 8. And the whole point here is when we talk about a laptop data center is that using modern technologies that are easily available now, if you had a Windows 8 machine or Windows 8 Pro, and when I say Windows 8, that means it could be Windows 8.1 or potentially Windows 10 when that comes out later in the year. Using a laptop, you could have multiple virtual machines installed. And so in part 1, we talked about how to install and configure Hyper-V and how to install an operating system onto it. And today, or in part 2, we're going to sort of take this to the next level. We're actually going to start setting up a quote-unquote data center on our laptop. And so we're basically going to cover installing Windows Server 2012 R2, which is the very latest operating system as of this writing. And we're going to set these up on two machines, two virtual machines. One is going to be the primary domain controller, and the second will be a backup domain controller, these are ultimately going to be Active Directory servers. And we're going to go into more detail about what that means. But the whole idea here is that we're going to be able to set up an Active Directory on our laptop with two machines. And also on there, we're going to need this for later on, so we're going to do it ahead of time, is we're going to install a DNS server, and DNS is Domain Name Service. And a DNS server is used to translate friendly names such as google.com or yahoo.com to IP addresses. And that also works internally too. So if you had an internal server name, the DNS is actually the thing that converts it from a friendly server name or workstation name to an IP address. And then finally, we'll install a DHCP server on both servers. DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, and this is basically a service that gives out IP addresses. But in this case, instead of using our Linksys or whatever, our router to give out IP addresses, what if our servers gave out IP addresses? If we did it that way, that means our DHCP service can also give out additional things like, hey, instead of pointing to the router for your DNS, why don't you point to us for your DNS? And you can set things like the default gateway and DNS servers and the domain suffix and things like that. So that's what the plan is for this video. We're going to install two Windows servers and get them ready for enabling Active Directory. And because we're going to need them later on, we're also going to install DNS and DHCP. Let's start off by doing a quick recap of where we left off in part 1. So in part 1, we basically have a modest machine. This isn't an actual laptop, by the way. This is a desktop machine, but I do have the things that we're talking about here I have set up on my laptop. But since it's already set up, that's why I'm using this desktop machine, because this is sort of my special projects machine. And since I was starting from scratch again, I figured I may as well just show the process that I would go through. So the fact that this isn't a laptop is really pretty inconsequential. The steps that you would take are really the same no matter what. And so this is basically an AMD processor and 16 gig of RAM. Again, RAM nowadays is really super cheap, so there's really no reason that you couldn't easily, upgrade to 16 or more gigabytes, which is more than enough to have a few extra virtual machines. And probably most importantly is to have an SSD drive, a solid state drive. And so in this case, I have a dedicated SSD for all of the system drives. So the C drive of any Windows machines or the boot partition of any Linux machines would basically go on this SSD. And then if I need additional storage space, I have an old spinning mechanical drive here. And so I can put other virtual drives over on that machine. And as we covered in part 1, right now I have a virtual machine set up for Windows 10. That's just a test workstation, but this is the machine we're going to put this stuff on. So I'm going to start off. So our plan is we talked about installing Windows Server on two machines. So I'm going to start by basically creating a new virtual machine. So again, I can right click over here and say new virtual machine over, by right clicking on the server. Or over in the right-hand navigation, I can also click on New Virtual Machine. And in here, this is very similar to if you followed part 1. This is really very similar. The significance here is I didn't really care about what the machine name was for my test workstation. But in this case, I actually do care what these server names are going to be. So for example, for this particular demo that we're doing here, I live in Florida, and probably the next closest metropolis to me is Tampa, and the airport code for Tampa is TPA, right? So I'm just going to go with that. For a domain name, I was thinking of using Tampa as the domain name, and so it'd be tampa.example.com, for example, if you were setting up, for example, a subdomain for a company or something like that. But in this case, I'm just going to be using Tampa, and the prefix for the server names I'll use as TPA. So in this case, I want TPA PDC, which is going to be the primary domain controller. So TPA is for Tampa, PDC is for primary domain controller, and that's just what I'm going to call my server. Some people choose to use all sorts of other names, or it's really up to you. I happen to prefer to use sort of a naming standard where the prefixes or the suffixes actually mean something, or adding on like a 0, 1 or things like that. I am more of a fan of doing it that way, so that's why I happen to be using this particular naming standard. But it's obviously totally up to you. As far as where I'm going to put this, now this again, we talked about that within this PC, there are basically there's an SSD for all the system drives. So in here is on the SSD is where I'm going to put the root drive, or the C drive for this server. So I'm just going to point to the VM definitions directory. That's sort of the root of where all the VMs are. I'm also going to copy that for my next machine. I can click next. Again, I always choose generation 1. I've never gotten anything to work with generation 2. In this case, I can probably easily give it 2 gig of RAM, and I'll use dynamic memory, so it'll give back some memory if it doesn't have to use it all, which for these machines it won't use anywhere near that. Now next, as far as the network goes, it really depends on what you want to do. I already have a DHCP server on my network, so if these VMs start giving out IP addresses, that could very well start causing a problem. So it just kind of depends on what it is that you need. So I'll just cover this scenario. In this particular case, let's say that I want to have virtual machines that can talk to each other and that I can talk to, but that they can't basically go out onto the network. Right? Let's just assume it's that scenario. And if that's the case, I'm going to use an internal virtual switch, which, if you're not familiar, and we covered this in the first video, over on the right-hand side navigation, there's a virtual switch manager. In there is where you can create these. And so I just created one of each. So if I choose an internal virtual switch, that means all of the virtual machines can talk to each other. All the machines that use the internal virtual switch can talk to each other, and me as the host machine can talk to them, but they can't go out onto the rest of the network. And so it's a way I can really have a pretty nice little sandbox here, where these machines can talk to each other, but they can't really mess up the rest of my network. So again, you might have a different setup, or you might have a different need for what you want to do here. So it just kind of depends. But that's how I'm going to use this, or that's how I'm going to set this up for this particular demo. As far as the hard drive, again, the default hard drive, I want to also, again, be on the E drive. The E drive is my SSD that I have dedicated for these virtual machines. So that means the SSD, the solid state drive, is going to be very, very fast. So the C drive within this server is going to be physically on a SSD, which is going to make it very, very fast. And it's also going to make it so I can host more than one machine and not have those machines bogged down either, because they're all going to be pretty fast. Next is what I want to install for an operating system. And in this case, again, I have a MSDN subscription, and it's highly recommended that you get one, especially for doing things like this, because you need licenses and you need media and all that. So I went and downloaded this ahead of time, and so when I did, I basically have valid licenses for this stuff through my MSDN subscription. In fact, here's a screenshot from MSDN. That has what this typically looks like. And so when I choose the Windows Server 2012 R2 entry, I can download the ISO, which is where the download button is on the right, and I can click on product keys to go see all the product keys that are assigned to me, or at least the allocations of licenses that I can download, and those are obfuscated out. But when you have an MSDN subscription, this is how you would this is how you basically get your licenses. And so in this case, I'm just using what I have available. So in this particular case, I'm going to be using data center keys, because that happens to be what I have a whole bunch of right now. So that's what I'm going to be using for this video. So from this directory where I downloaded these ISOs, I'm going to use the Windows Server Server 2012 R2 download, or ISO, that I got from MSDN, and that's what it's going to boot up using the very first time. I click next. This does a quick summary. I click finish, and it creates my virtual machine. So I still haven't installed anything on it. It's just the definition of it is now created. And because I can very easily run these in parallel, I'm going to do the same exact thing for the BDC. At this point, I have two virtual machine definitions, so I'm going to go ahead and kick those off, or I'm going to start them up. And each one of them should basically start the Windows install. And this process is very, very similar to Windows Workstation, if you've ever done that, like Windows 8, for example. There's really only one notable exception, and I'll just do one of these and then I'll skip ahead. And that is what kind of setup you want to do. In addition to choosing the various options that you might normally choose during setup, you can choose things such as installing just the server core and things like that. So let me put in my my super secret license, and then I'll continue. So this is the screen I was just mentioning, and this is worth talking about for just a second. The server with GUI is what you would might expect. If you plan on interactively administering the server with the user interface, the server with GUI is, that's the option you would typically use. For a production installation or something that's especially something that's going to be internet facing, you would choose the server core installation. And really what that is, it's basically just the core of Windows Server. Because if you think about it, every additional program that you have installed is a potential a vulnerability for that server to be attacked, right? So you want to have as little software installed as possible. And so for production implementations, and especially for anything internet facing, you'd almost always choose server core installation. But in this case, this is just going to be a sandbox, and I want the convenience of being able to use UI tools. So I'm going to choose server with GUI. I'm just going to use all the available disk space of my virtual drive. And then we let it install. Okay, at this point, we didn't do anything extra. We pretty much just, chose a couple of those few options at the beginning of the install, and then it needed to reboot a couple times. And now that it came back from a reboot, now it's going to allow us to set the password. And then this is very similar to Windows 8, where it leaves you on a desktop, and then from here you can log in. So at this point, we can run this in full screen mode when this comes back. And so notice that even though we're still within the same machine here, I'm running this as full screen. And so basically this is the new server manager that's relatively new from, I think, 2012 onward. And so at this point, there's just a couple of things I want to do. First is I want to rename this server, because I've been calling it TPA PDC, but when it installs it, it actually just gives it a random name. So it's one of the first things I want to be able to do here. So I'm going to go into here, do change, and I'm going to call this TPA PDC. Then click OK. And this is always going to ask me to do a reboot after it's done. So I'm going to restart that. Meanwhile, if I can type the password correct, let's see. This is the BDC. So this is just catching up, and I'm basically going to do exactly the same thing here on the BDC. Same thing, I'm going to run this in full screen. Let's go rename this. To TPA BDC. And let this thing reboot. on the PDC. Let's take a quick look, make sure the server name got set. And it is, we're on the PDC, that's good. So one thing I want to kick off here is I want to add a role. There's the roles and features. And I got to that, by the way, from this server manager, which is the first icon here. You can always get to this if it doesn't start. And there's add roles and features. So under here, I'm going to go into this role-based or feature-based installation. I'm going to automatically choose the local server. And then in the list here, I'm going to choose DHCP and DNS. And the error message that it gave me was that I don't have a static IP address. Because I'm on a private network here, I can probably safely set the IP address. So let me do that actually, because it's going to keep on giving us error messages about that. So I'm going to go into here and let me go just manually set it to something. And I guess maybe to keep this separate, I'll make this a 10 network, because you might remember that this is sort of like a private network. So I'll call this, in this case, 10.0. My keyboard doesn't work that way. 10.0.0. Let's call this 10. And even though it's a class A, we'll make this class C for the purposes of keeping things straight. Same thing here, 10.0.0.1, which will set it to that. And for this, 10.0.0.1 for this as well. So now we have a static IP address, because both DHCP and DNS, they really want to have a static IP. So now that we've done that, I click next. And that's all we're going to install on this server for now. Yeah, restart the server in case you need to. And this is just sort of a summary that says what it's going to install. And then you basically let it kick off. And while it's running, let's go take a look over on the BDC. Same thing, let's go verify that the server rename went successfully. And it did. Here we are as the PDC. And then let's also go set a static IP to this. And because the PDC was 10, let's make this 1.11. That way we can keep these things together. And this will be 10.0.0.1 as well. Okay, so now that we have a static IP address, now we're going to go add roles and features. And again, this is the BDC. So on this one, we're going to choose the local server, choose DHCP. Not sure why it still says that, because we just set it. DNS, next, and then we do install. And that's pretty much all there is to getting DHCP and DNS installed. Okay, on the PDC, it looks like everything's complete. As you can see, you can either close this or just leave this up, and it says configuration required, which we know that we're going to have to do some configuration for both of these. But in this particular step, we're just worried about getting things installed. So I think we're all set for the PDC. Let's go look at the BDC. That's here. And it says it was successful here too. So at this point, what I would do, so I have two Windows Server 2012 R2 machines installed. We installed DNS and DHCP on both servers, and we did set the name on both of them. One other key thing I would do before we go on to the next step is kick off the Windows Update on here. So here I'm going to turn on Windows Update so that it automatically picks up patches and things like that, overnight. So many times that when you do a fresh install of the operating system, it's way behind on patches, and so that's one thing I do want to do before we go on to the next step. But that's pretty much it for this step. We now have two Windows Server 2012 machines installed on our Windows 8 workstation. So here it is. So we have our Windows 10 machine that we did in part 1 of this series, and now we have two servers. They don't have Active Directory installed yet. We're going to do that in the next step. But right now we just have two servers with static IP addresses that have DHCP and DNS installed. So see part 3 of the series, where we'll actually talk about configuring DHCP, DNS, and installing Active Directory, and actually standing up our Active Directory. Thanks for watching. If you like videos like this, please subscribe to this channel, follow @RobCedar on Twitter, or go to blog.robcedar.com.